And now we move on into Roman numeral 2, where we're talking about who's who in the judicial system, or who exactly is suing me. Now, this is a fairly short one, but what we're talking about is these are basically the terminologies that's referring to the different people that are in a court case and so forth. We start with the plaintiff or the prosecution. The plaintiff and the prosecution are the people that are bringing a case before the court. So again, plaintiff or prosecution, the people bringing the case before court. Plaintiff or prosecution, people bringing a case before the court. The difference between plaintiff and prosecution is what type of case it is. Plaintiff is a civil case, prosecution is a criminal case. So plaintiff is civil, prosecution is criminal. Plaintiff is civil, prosecution is criminal. The other big difference is that while a plaintiff can be anyone, prosecution is always the government. The government is always the prosecution because only the government can bring a criminal case. So the prosecution or state's evidence, etc., that's the prosecution. They're always the government, the district attorney, etc., cannot ever be an individual. Now, the government can be a plaintiff if they were suing you, but they could, no one else could ever be the prosecution. Defendant, on the other hand, the defendant is always the person answering the charges. Again, the defendant is the person who's answering the charges. Again, the defendant is the person who's answering the charges. They're the ones who are being sued or being arrested. It's the same for both civil and criminal. So that one's fairly simple. Again, defendant is simply the guy who's on trial, whether they're being sued or whether they're being put in jail. They're the ones who are answering the case. Now, if a case is appealed, if it goes to the state Supreme Court or the U.S. Supreme Court, then you have to deal with petitioner and respondent. Petitioner is the person who's bringing the case to the Supreme Court. The petitioner is the person who's bringing the case to the Supreme Court. The respondent is the person who is responding. The respondent is the person who is responding. The other thing to understand is that if you're looking at the name of a case, the first name is always petitioner and the second name is always respondent. So in Tinker v. Des Moines, Tinker is petitioner, Des Moines is respondent. In the case of like a criminal case, it would be like, say, State versus Johnson. State is the prosecution, Johnson is the defendant. Now, this is where it gets a little bit trickier because the only people who generally can appeal a case, generally speaking, are the losers of the original case. So, the petitioner is oftentimes the defendant from the first trial. So in the case of Tinker v. Des Moines, it's because Tinker was found guilty in the criminal case. They sued, or they appealed, made it up to the Supreme Court. But because, again, they were the ones doing the appealing, they went from defendant to petitioner. Likewise, Des Moines, which was the city that was doing the criminal action, went from being the prosecution to being the respondent. Lawyers, the next term, lawyers are professionals who represent you in court. Lawyers are the professionals who represent you and your side in court. Lawyers are regulated. They have to pass their own bar exam is what it's called. The bar exam is what the test you have to take to become a lawyer. And they have their own different code of ethics and so forth. So they are regulated organizations. You don't have to have a lawyer if you are being arrested or suing or anything like that. It's just really recommended because remember what I said earlier. The American judicial system is built around a series of procedures and rules and so forth. And if you don't know what you are doing, you could oftentimes end up in deep trouble. So even if you don't want to pay for a lawyer or whatever, it's better to try to find a lawyer of some sort because otherwise you could end up in trouble, not because you're necessarily guilty, but because you didn't know the rules of the game. So that creates a slight problem. Then you've got judges and you've got justices. Judges or justices, these are the neutral people in charge of the trial. These are the ones that are saying whether or not procedure is being followed correctly. These are the ones that follow the rules of the court, to make sure the rules of the court are being followed correctly. So again, judges or justices, these are the guys who make sure that the rules of the courtroom are being followed correctly. The difference between them, justices are on Supreme Courts, both state Supreme Courts and the U.S. Supreme Court, but they are only on Supreme Courts. Judges, on the other hand, are on the lower courts, or what are called the inferior courts. They deal with like criminal matters and civil matters. The other difference is that judges are passive. Again, their job is to be neutral. They don't ask questions, they don't interrogate witnesses, they don't find out information. They simply make sure that you are following the rules. Justices, on the other hand, are allowed to be active. The Supreme Court justices get to ask questions, for example. They don't interrogate witnesses, but they definitely are allowed to be much more active than judges are. They ask questions and they try to form their own opinions, whereas judges don't do that. A judge can be convinced you're guilty, but they can't say anything about it or do anything about it. All they can do is influence the trial itself. And finally, you've got juries/jurors. A jury is the people that are... English fun. A jury is the group of people that determines guilt or innocence in a criminal case. In a civil case, they determine whether or not you owe money. Jury is usually made up of 12 individuals called jurors. The jurors are the individuals who make up a jury. And again, a jury is 12 individuals. I don't think that changes by state. I could be wrong, but I'm reasonably sure every state is simply 12 individuals. The jurors, as we'll talk about, are chosen carefully by the other lawyers during something called voir dire, but the jurors are supposed to be representative of the community, so they're from the immediate area. You don't bring in jurors from outside. Likewise, there is no such thing as like a professional juror. Jurors are supposed to be, again, random people from the community who decide your guilt or innocence. They are the final authority on this one. So again, the judges don't determine guilt or innocence. It's always up to the jury. Now, that should give you a rough idea about the terminology of who is who. From here, we'll move in talking about Roman numeral 3, judicial review, and how all of that works out.